What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be talking about some new spoilers for the 9th edition Chaos Demons Codex that has just been posted today, the 12th of August, 2022, by Warhammer Community. This is a pretty exciting little tidbit from the new Chaos Demons Codex because it is their new core mechanic, a la doctrines in the Space Marine Codex, command protocols in the Necron Codex. This is going to be what defines a pure Chaos Demons army, rather than just being a collection of Chaos keyworded idiots. And this ability looks really cool. So this is the Warp Storm ability. Essentially, it looks like it's going to function kind of like command points, where it gives you an additional resource mechanic on top of your CP, sort of like Cabal points in Thousand Suns, I guess would be the closest analog, which makes a ton of sense given that they're both Chaos subfactions. But how these new Warp Storm points are going to work is that a new pool of them will be generated at the start of every turn. It says turn in the article. I don't know if they literally mean every single turn of the game, which means you would generate a new number on your turn and your opponent's turn, or whether they just mean at the start of the battle round. I have a sneaking suspicion it's probably every single turn, because there are a lot of effects, at least in the preview here, that are useful in your opponent's turn. But how you actually generate those dice is by rolling 8d6 and then counting how many 4+ out of those you score. So the average number of Warp Storm points that we're talking about is going to be 4. And given the cost of a lot of these abilities, only generating them once per battle round seems like it would be pretty restrictive, especially like we're talking about here. There's a -1 to hit Descending Shadow ability, which costs you 3 Warp Storm points. That would be like essentially the entirety of the Warp Storm points for that battle round if it only scored at the battle round. So I do think that they mean what they say when it's the start of every turn, meaning that this is actually going to be a pretty incredibly powerful ability. Now, the number of abilities you have access to is going to be pretty high. All demonic armies, they say here, have access to 8 Chaos Undivided effects, which are these 2 that we have spoiled here, Malicious Misdirection. In addition, we're also going to get mark-specific powers as well. So we'll get access to additional effects from having Khorne units, Nurgle units, Slaanesh units, and Tzeentch units. Now, these god-specific abilities are only unlocked from having a detachment entirely dedicated to that Chaos God, meaning that in order to get the Khorne Warp Storm abilities, for example, you're going to need an entirely Khorne detachment. That still means that we're probably dealing with 8 core Warp Storm abilities, plus 3 for each detachment fully out of each Chaos God you have, meaning that if you have 1 to 2 detachments out of specific Chaos God allegiances, then you're going to be dealing with probably 11 to 14 additional abilities to keep track of, thanks to this Warp Storm ability. Now, let's talk about exactly what these effects are that have been previewed so far. Obviously, we have the ones that we talked about previously, the undivided abilities. The first one being Descending Shadow. This is actually one of the more powerful abilities that we've seen of this type. It costs you 3 Warp Storm points, but that means that it costs you 3 Warp Storm points, so it's going to be the majority of your Warp Storm points for that turn. If you are rolling 4, which is, again, if that's the average, but obviously you could roll higher and have 5 or 6 and have a lot to spend, or you could just blank out and get nothing at all. So I think that's in keeping with the theme of Chaos Demons as a very chaotic army. This effect is extremely inconsistent, which makes it very difficult to build a game plan around. But there are going to be some effects that shore up your Warp Storm points. And I'm sure there's going to be a mechanical framework in the Codex of rules that interacts with Warp Storm points, like stratagems to generate more, maybe Warlord traits, maybe some relics and stuff that will get you additional Warp Storm points. Anyway, for every Legiones Daemonica unit, which I imagine is the entirety of the army, that's going to be the new army keyword, if the attacker is more than 12 inches away from them and firing at them with a ranged attack, they get -1 to hit. So, especially on turn 1, you'll just blanket a -1 to hit across your entire army, which, in addition to those demonic invulnerable saves that we talked about in the previous spoiler video about Chaos Demons, where they're going to have an unignorable invulnerable save that improves itself depending on whether or not you're in ranged or melee, and most demons are going to have a very strong invulnerable save against ranged attacks. So that, on top of a -1 to hit army-wide, is going to make this army actually significantly more survivable against ranged attacks than they were. They're probably one of the squishiest armies of the game previously, and now they're going to be, I'm not going to say ridiculously difficult to kill. They're not Heretic Astartes level, but they are going to be pretty difficult to take down with ranged attacks alone. We also have Malicious Misdirection here. This is 2 Warp Storm points. This one's significantly less exciting. You use the effect at the start of the reinforcement step of your opponent's movement phase, and I do like the kind of theme of this ability at redirecting and befuddling enemy forces, which is definitely a Chaos Demons themed mechanic, but all it does is make their strategic reserves come in as if it were the second battle round, not the third battle round, which means that, for example, enemy units could not be placed in your deployment zone if they're coming off table edges thanks to strategic reserves. Now, importantly, this only affects strategic reserves, not reinforcement units, which means that units coming out of Deep Strike, out of teleporters, out of Manta Strike, out of drop pods, none of those are affected. Only units that are coming in off the table edges with the normal strategic reserve rules in the core rulebook, such as the ones you paid CP to enter strategic reserve at the start of the game, those are the only units that are being affected by this, which means the effectiveness is very limited. And for 2 Warp Storm points, which is probably around half of the Warp Storm points that you have for that turn, it's kind of a lot to spend. If your opponent's trying to get in your deployment zone to do some retrieve Nephilim data, and you can bounce them back outside your deployment zone and prevent them from completing that action, that can be worth a lot. So there are going to be situations in which this is useful, and part of the skill expression of using this mechanic is going to be remembering all these abilities, since it sounds like there's going to be quite a few. Anyway, let's talk about some of the Chaos God specific ones. So again, just to reiterate, these are kind of like stratagems in that they require an entirely undivided detachment that is keyworded with the specific Chaos God to use these. First off, Fury of Khorne. This costs you 4 Warp Storm points, but it gives you +1 attack to all of your Legiones Daemonica Khorne units. That's army-wide. Every Khorne unit on the table gets that benefit. Importantly, this isn't just your fight phase. You can do it at the start of any fight phase. So if you're generating 4 Warp Storm points at the start of your opponent's turn, and you have ongoing combats or they're charging into you, you can burn all your Warp Storm points to get that additional effect. Now, depending on the unit size of demons, I know there's been some rumors going around that the lesser demons, the infantry, are going to be dropping in unit size. 4 Warp Storm points for +1 attack on 10 models isn't that exciting to me, but if it's on a big brick of 20 bloodletters, that can be pretty gross. If you have a lot of combats ongoing, it can actually be pretty efficient. It can be a lot of additional value if most of your army is engaged. I'm sure that's what Khorne armies want to be doing. How often there are a wide swath of engagements happening where there's not interrupts happening and units are dying in the middle of the fight phase is not super often, so I think oftentimes you're going to be using this to buff a single unit, but it does affect everything, so even characters and stuff are going to get that bonus as well. Now, moving on to the Nurgle effect. Again, this is an army-wide effect, and it pulses out a potential for mortal wounds from all of your Nurgle units. You roll a d6 at the start of your shooting phase for each enemy unit within 12 inches of a Legiones Daemonica Nurgle unit. On a 6, they take D3 mortal wounds. Now, obviously, a 6 isn't a great odds, but some stuff to remember about this. First, it's 2 Warp Storm points, so it's actually really inexpensive. It hits everything within 12, every enemy unit, which means it hits characters, it hits untargetable units like, plasma sites that are 1 wound single entity that are typically untargetable will still get hit by this wave of sickness, and there is a potential that they just die. So if your opponent has a ton of stuff within that 12-inch aura, it might be worth just forcing it out. That said, you need, in order to get the D3 mortal wounds out, you probably need somewhere around 5 or 6 enemy units to feel very consistent about it. If you can hit your opponent's whole army, you probably get 2 or 3 activations of D3 mortal wounds. But whether or not that's worth your Warp Storm points, I don't know. There's probably going to be some other effects in there that are pretty important. But it is also important to remember that this is end of your shooting phase, which means your army has already moved once this has happened. And if you have some relatively fast units like Plague Drones that can run up in the middle of your opponent's army and pulse this out, that could potentially be pretty useful. Less exciting than the Fury of Khorne +1 attacks for your whole army, but, it's all right, I guess. Moving on to Tzeentch and Slaanesh. Tzeentch might be just probably the most consistent effect that we've seen so far. You just get +1 to cast on all your Psykers. So that's pretty good. Given that in the past, every Tzeentch unit has been a Psyker, if you are bringing an entirely Tzeentch detachment, and it looks like Tzeentch units are going to be pretty powerful with incredible invulnerable saves against ranged attacks now. Alongside, I think there have been some rumors that Lords of Change are going to be absolutely disgusting. So we may see a lot of pure Tzeentch detachments coming out of this codex, and if we do, and assuming that all of those units continue to be Psykers, playing 3 Warp Storm points for +1 to cast for everything in the army is a pretty big deal. Take it as somebody who's a Tyranid player and who routinely uses +1 to cast effects. It's pretty good. Those are good things to have. Moving on to the last one we have here, Mesmerizing Dance from Slaanesh. Gives all of your Slaanesh units fight first. Interestingly, this sounds like Slaanesh units are not going to innately fight first, which they currently do in the current version of the Chaos Demons Codex, thanks to their Quicksilver Swiftness ability. And that may speak to the fact, an open question that we had from when we were covering the previewed data sheets from the Codex, that those core god-specific effects, things like the Unstoppable Ferocity for Khorne Demons, it gives them +1 strength of attack on the charge, may be going away. Or, obviously, they could just be changing, so we actually don't know. Maybe the demonic loci turn into their permanent effects, and then we get their original subfaction effects from these Warp Storm abilities. Who knows? But fight first across your whole army is an incredibly powerful ability. If you're taking a charge, burning that 4 Warp Storm points on making your army fight first essentially gives you an unlimited number of free interrupts that do not cost you any command points. Instead, they're going to cost you your regenerating resource rather than your finite resource. And that is really sick. So this is pretty good. Even if it only gives you the effect of a single interrupt or messes up with your opponent's fight phase priority, that's probably still worth it, because again, these Warp Storm points are going to refresh every turn, whereas your command points don't. And 2 CP for even 1 interrupt is as much as you get in an entire battle round just out of generating the normal Battleforge command points in Warzone Nephilim. This is probably going to be a pretty good value, even if you're only getting that 1 fight first out of it. So overall, these god-specific effects seem incredibly powerful. The Nurgle one is so much more situational to me, in my opinion. You need a really MSU enemy army, and even then, spreading mortal wounds out over a wide area rather than drilling them into a single unit is the least effective distribution of mortal wounds, because your opponents can put them on models that don't necessarily matter, and you're not actually removing units from it. But again, if your opponent has a lot of really low model count units that only have a couple wounds in them, the ability to try to pick them off for 2 Warp Storm points is pretty good. I do think I am a little bit worried about the Khorne one, to be honest, and thinking more about it, because it doesn't actually protect your army at all. And the Slaanesh effect can be used defensively, whereas the Tzeentch effect is very offensive, and those are both going to be a little bit better. The Khorne effect needs you to either already be in melee or be confident that you're going to survive an attack in melee on your opponent's turn, and those are a little bit scarier. It still feels like this Khorne has always been kind of the lost child of the Chaos Gods, where Games Workshop isn't really sure where their design space should go, and that kind of feels like where we're at. As it turns out, if you have a faction focused on being super tanky, and you have a faction focused on being super fast, the faction that basically deals damage in the same way but just deals more damage is neither tanky nor fast, and then makes the delivery of that damage really tough, and that's always been Khorne's kind of problem. Before we wrap up the video here, we do have a little bit of a preview of Epidemious' new effect. Previously, he used to have a chart that would tick up the more models were killed by Nurgle demons, and that would give those Nurgle demons some additional effects, and ended up being a pretty powerful effect, especially in mixed Nurgle lists, because he would affect every demon, including Death Guard units, which is a pretty cool thing. But now he's going to be impacting your Warp Storm roll. So now if you destroy 7 or more models, importantly models not units, with your Nurgle units, you will get +1 Warp Storm point at the first Warp Storm roll of your next battle round. Then that resets the count, and you can continue to score that count up later. This does specify Warp Storm rolls at the start of the battle round, so that does kind of throw into question the turn nomenclature that they used previously. It may actually be per battle round, which would be it would be pretty significantly less powerful effect. But I guess we'll just have to wait to the Codex. It's a little bit up in the air right now, just thanks to the preview article, but that's okay. That's what preview articles are for. Open some questions that we're going to ask when we take a look at that Codex. But it gives you +1 Warp Storm point at the end of that Warp Storm roll. A little bit of a slow effect, just +1 point each battle round, and it is capped to the battle round. Is relatively slow, but again, it gets you to that. Looks like 3 or 4 Warp Storm point is going to be kind of the cutoff to where the really powerful abilities unlock, and being able to kind of shore up a bad Warp Storm roll with his ability is going to be pretty good. Depending on the matchup, the 7 model tally isn't going to be that difficult to score out. It will be a little bit early game, but once you get to round 2 and round 3, units are fighting for the center objectives and start actually getting into melee, especially with those relatively slow Nurgle units, then it will start ticking up pretty quickly. And I'm having a sneaking suspicion that having faster Nurgle units, as is almost always the case of Nurgle, the higher speed value you get on a Nurgle unit, the better that Nurgle unit's going to be, because you can project that wave of sickness aura more earlier, and being able to move out and start tallying up this Tally of Pestilence early is also going to be really important. Anyway, This ability is really sick. I love these push towards these faction abilities that really define how a faction works, and I'm really excited to see Chaos Demons in play. So that's going to be it for the video today. Thanks everyone for watching all the way to the end. Big thanks to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise, here on YouTube as a YouTube channel member, or on Twitch as a Twitch subscriber. All you are great. I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.